and welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to do a fairly chatty video. There won't be any visuals. I won't be putting any books up. So definitely feel free to just listen to this and not worry about having to visually see me. But today I really I wanted to just sit down and think about my reading voice, or my reading, what makes me interested in what I'm reading. Maybe also considering the change in my reading taste over the years. And I just really wanted to spend this video today sort of reflecting back on my reading journal, not journal, but reading journey up to now. Because I've been considering lately whether or not my reading tastes have changed. I feel like I've started going more towards nonfiction, or at least be more intellectually intrigued by nonfiction versus fiction. And I'm actually very excited about that. I'm very excited about that change. And it just made me think about how my reading has evolved over the years. So I just really thought it would be really fun to sort of go on that journey together and really just think about what were the triggers for my current tastes. When were the major changes in my reading taste throughout my life? So let's just start off, and let's just go with like childhood, basically. I don't really recall too much the books I read in my infancy. When I go back home to Texas every year, my mom kept all of the books, but there aren't the traditional books that you have for like 1-year-olds and 2-year-olds and things like that. Now, I don't know if that means that she gave them away once we grew up, or what the case was, but they just don't exist. And you have to consider the fact that I am French, in a French family, but I was raised in the US. So my parents didn't know what the famous books were for children, for traditional American children. And then also there's the fact that we didn't have access to what traditional French children would give to their children at a young age. So I remember my favorite book, maybe my earliest memory of a book would be it's very, very famous Texas book, and it's called The Legend of the Bluebonnet. And I just wanted to look up the author's name, and that's by Tommy de Paula. So The Legend of the Bluebonnet, the Texas flower is the bluebonnet, and it really gives you it's a lovely story about like the Native American history behind the bluebonnet, the legend of the bluebonnet, how the bluebonnet reflects the ancestry and things like that. And that book, I was absolutely captivated by the story and the art, and just this idea of this Texas history that I absolutely adored. Now, that I can confidently say was my favorite book. But I remember I was in love with the Berenstain Bears. I really loved the Berenstain Bears, although recently I've learned that you're actually supposed to pronounce it Berenstein Bears, I believe, is the current. I couldn't believe, I never knew that kind of internet fact. But I really loved that series. And then after that, I just remember stuff like Charlotte's Web. I remember that one very clearly because I remember my mom used to always go to bed at 10 p.m. every night so that she could read. And so I would want to read with her. So I very clearly remember bringing Charlotte's Web with me so I could read next to her. So definitely there were chapter books like that. But the biggest influence I had when I was like elementary school would be the Nancy Drew series. Once I discovered the Nancy Drew series, that's all I read. I loved the Nancy Drew series, especially the original and those yellow covers. Those were just absolutely the best. And I just read right through those. I read pretty much every single one that existed. I had a wonderful collection. And in the very, very early days of the internet, so when I was like 6th grade, middle school, fifth grade, middle school, basically. I actually started I don't know how I did it and where I found the people, but I actually started a Nancy Drew newsletter. I had created an email group and I was typing up these newsletters, and yeah, I communicated to, I believe, were adults, because when I revealed my age once I closed down the newsletter, like, oh, I can't believe you were this age, and da 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 da. So very, very fun little fact that I created one of the very first Nancy Drew fan groups on the internet. So yeah, that was kind of like my elementary. Now I had a brief stint with fantasy because I made some friends who were very big into fantasy. They were very big in the series, the Redwall series. Now I never read that, but they were huge into that. But on my brother's bookcase, and I don't know why it was there because my brother was never a reader. Definitely he never read fantasy, but we owned it. Maybe he did read it at some point. Maybe he picked it up from someone. I have no idea where the book came from. But there was a book by Terry Brooks, a very famous fantasy writer. Although I do actually, despite not reading fantasy, I do still watch a lot of fantasy booktubers, and they never read Terry Brooks. So I don't know what the story behind that is, why no one reads him, and like everyone only reads Brandon Sanderson, it feels. So I don't know what happened to the classic fantasy authors, but I read Terry Brooks. So there was this one book called Magic Kingdom for Sale, Sold. And I absolutely loved that book. Now, I believe there were sequels to that series, but I just wasn't aware of them, so I read the book as a standalone. But I absolutely loved that series, and it made me pick up the original Shannara series, which like the Elfstones of Shannara, the Scion of Shannara, or something like that. But basically, the Shannara series is quite long now, but the original 3 books, the original trilogy, I actually read. And I absolutely loved it, and I had a really, really good time. But that was pretty much the only fantasy I read. The only thing is that when I come into middle school, I did read The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley, and I absolutely just plowed through those books. That was again another trilogy, and The Mists of Avalon I thought was absolutely superb. So I read those in between 5th and 6th grade, I would say. I think I read the entire series during the summer. You might consider that I was probably too young for them. I don't know. But it felt right at the time, and I really enjoyed that. I loved the richness of the world. I loved the female characters. And I really loved the sort of mystical quality back then. But funny enough, I just never really got into fantasy, more into that. It wasn't, I don't know why, but I was satisfied with what I read, and it just wasn't a genre that attracted me more than what I had already read. And then my friends who were big fantasy readers couldn't really convince me to read those, basically. Now, the turning point came in 6th grade, where for my 6th grade birthday, for again, American system for all the American viewers, in 6th grade, my mom gave me Les Mis. So Les Mis by Victor Hugo. She did give it to me in English because again, we were in the US, and that's what we had access to. So I did read Les Miserables in English. I read the Signet Classics edition, which I think is quite good. I actually quite like Signet Classics. I feel like because they're like little paperback versions, people don't really talk about them, but I really thought the translation was quite good. As long with their Don Quixote translation, I think is fantastic, whoever did that. But yeah, the real turning point was receiving Les Mis from my mom. I never questioned her giving it. I was never like, oh, this looks boring, or this is a classic, or like, oh, it's so long, why did you give this to me? No, because back then, there wasn't YouTube, or there wasn't social media, or anything like that. So there was no one really to tell you, oh, classics are so boring, So I was able to go into this book knowing nothing about it, knowing nothing about the history, not knowing that it was actually this huge French classic. I didn't know all these things. My mom gave me the book. I've always respected my mom. She has fantastic taste in like everything, so I respected that. And I read it and I absolutely fell in love with it. I was so proud of myself. I remember carrying this 1,463 page book around school and always trying to catch more pages. And yeah, I read the entire thing and I absolutely loved that. So Les Mis was really a huge turning point for me in middle school. It really gave me, it really basically made me jump from basically school age books to full-fledged adult literature, etc. And it was a very natural transition. I think back then there wasn't really this concept of young adult like there is now. If it existed, I just didn't know about it. But definitely, I don't think it was at least even if those type of books did exist, and I'm sure they existed, but it wasn't a category within itself. It wasn't this huge category at Barnes and Nobles that like you could say, oh, I want a young adult book and go there immediately. It was something you just kind of had to discover on your own. So because that genre didn't even really exist at the time, there's no way for me to have exposure to it. Again, social media wasn't a thing. So really, I just immediately made the transition to adult books. Now, that doesn't mean that I immediately started reading classics and all that stuff. Middle school and high school, for the majority, I just read what was required for school. That was enough. I was busy enough. Every once in a while, I would read something else. I remember trying to read like Sense and Sensibility, but that was too difficult for me at the time. I couldn't really get into the English. The English was, I thought was actually quite difficult. But in any case, I really enjoyed like all the classics we had to read for middle school, like 1984, Animal Farm. I really enjoyed all the Shakespeare we read. So even though I wasn't really reading so much on my own, I was definitely appreciating all these books. And I do think having read Les Mis helped me, again, because I had read something that was adult literature at such a young age. I never had this outside influence that was like, oh, this is boring just because it's an adult book, just because it's literature, it's boring. So I never had that. I was able to skip that bad influence. So that was really good for me. Now, high school is when I started experimenting a little bit more, but not necessarily experimenting so much as being able to analyze my particular interests according to the required reading for school. So I think the biggest thing for me was, so there were three major points in high school. So other than the fact that I loved what we read a lot of American fiction. So we read like Native Son, we read Black Boy, we read, for Spanish class, I read Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. We read Tim O'Brien, etc., along with Shakespeare and whatnot. And a lot of books from UK, like Wuthering Heights and things like that. So the traditional stuff. But I think in terms of my current interests, and even though I didn't know it at the time, but definitely like little sparks, little gems that really influence my current reading, I think the biggest ones would be from English class when we read war fiction. So All Quiet on the Western Front, and then again Tim O'Brien, all the things they carried, which was about the Vietnam War. I think just the impact those books carried to me, just the drama, the idea of like the consequences of war, both on a social scale but an individual scale, and then just the interaction with like other countries, just because most of the books you read are pretty much within your own country, even though we read American fiction or I read French fiction, but just interaction within your own people is a lot different than two countries at war with one another. And I thought that was really very intriguing, especially for someone like me who shares two cultures, both the French culture and the American culture, where I, and now even looking at myself from a modern sense, where now I live in Japan. But for me, growing up, I always was the type where I picked all the good stuff from each culture and I made my personality based off of that. So the fact that two cultures can go at war with each other, I thought was really, really fascinating. Now, another book that I didn't realize at the time became a huge influence to my reading later on was history class, when we read the book Hiroshima by John Hersey. Hiroshima obviously is all about the bombing of Hiroshima in Japan during World War II, which basically ended the war on the Japanese side. And that, for me, I was absolutely fascinated that by that little book when we read it. And later I would come to discover that really, really fueled my interest later on, when I pretty much read and still want to read. I still have a lot of books on my TBR, but right now I haven't been focusing on it. But there was a moment a few years ago, like around 2012, 2013, 2014, etc., where I pretty much read primarily Japanese books, but especially books about Japan during the war. Because Japan, the thing that's interesting about Japan during the war is that they were both the victim and the aggressor. So it really makes for a lot of interesting reading. So reading Hiroshima in high school definitely was a big, big thing. Now, obviously, everyone who watches this channel knows that I have a big, love for Japanese, well, anything Japanese, but Japanese literature specifically. And at that time, high school was when I read Memoirs of a Geisha. It's when I read the Makioka Sisters. It's when I read Thousand Cranes. So at that point, because I had already discovered a fascination for Japan, that was the time where I was exploring Japanese literature. Also, I also had the positive influence of my grandmother, who really liked Japanese literature. And it was definitely, I have actually a lot of readers amongst my aunts and uncles, my mom and my grandmother, etc., my grandfather too. Grandfather was a big history reader, which I definitely think eventually had a big influence on me. But it's just that, at that time was when I was really picking up a lot of Japanese literature, and I was starting to get, starting to really enjoy it, because I was starting to know a lot more about this Japan other than just anime. And so being able to put my knowledge together with this new world of Japanese literature was really, really exciting. So that would really, these things would really create a huge base for my future reading. Now, another big discovery in high school was Stefan Zweig. Stefan Zweig is an amazing Austrian author, because he really takes like the parts of humanity that aren't focused on because they're not good qualities of humanity. There's a lot of manipulation, there's a lot of ego, but it's done in a way that is just so beautiful, that it's just absolutely fascinating. For me, Stefan Zweig, I think, is the master of what I call the confessional monologue, where basically his books are typically a character encounters another character, and that character recounts some moment that brought him to that area, to that spot, basically. And it's a monologue, but it's always confessing something. There's something about that event that led to the character being where they are now. So yeah, Stefan Zweig, I always recommend him. He's a general recommendation that I just can't stop recommending. So those were the big influences in high school. It's Japanese war fiction, and then European fiction with Stefan Zweig. Now, college, the big thing about college was obviously I had two majors. I was quite busy with my majors, so I didn't really get to read it too much outside of school, and I was still trying to find my voice. So actually, surprisingly enough, my biggest influence probably came from my Japanese major. I had to take one class in particular, which was called Religious Violence in Modern East Asia. And that class was absolutely fascinating. It was difficult. I could never get higher than a B on all my papers, but I was never really good at writing papers, I have to confess. But that class was absolutely fascinating. I read, there was quite a bit of nonfiction that we had to read, and I really wanted to focus on, well, first there was one called, the book was called Religious Violence in Contemporary Japan, the Case of Aum Shinrikyo. Aum Shinrikyo is a cult, which they grew in Japan, and then in 1995 they were the perpetrators of this major gas attack, sarin gas, in the Tokyo subway station, which killed a lot of people. And it was a big shock because Japan is basically not really known for its domestic terrorism, but that was a huge case, and I thought that nonfiction book was fascinating. We also read a book called History in Three Keys: The Boxers as Event, Experience, and Myth by Paul A. Cohen, and that also was absolutely fascinating. And then we read God's Chinese Son by Jonathan Spence, and that's because of this class I was able to discover the historian Jonathan Spence, of whom I've read many more of his works since then. So that was a moment where I was discovering, so I had only really read Hiroshima as nonfiction, and like the Diary and Frank. Those were pretty much, if I can, looking back at my list, that's all I can really recall as to the only nonfiction I had read. So all of a sudden, because of this class, I was introduced to a lot more nonfiction, and it was nonfiction based off Asia and Asia's history and just historical events, and again, war and whatnot, World War II. And that definitely triggered something in me because I have read so much in those categories since then. And now I'm definitely into history. I'm definitely into reading a lot of history, and I'm reading a lot of nonfiction these days. But yeah, mostly, primarily historical nonfiction. Let's not pretend I'm reading like how to 10 ways to declutter your life or things like that. Like, that's not really the nonfiction I'm talking about. I'm talking about historical nonfiction. But yeah, those were definitely really the big triggers. Now, I was also, because there's a lot of fiction in French, translated fiction in French, I should clarify. I was definitely experimenting quite a bit of that in college. Every time I went back to France, I would try and read something. And that was definitely due to my grandmother's and my mother's influence. They were always curious. They didn't, about like fiction and fiction around the world, they didn't really have any sort of like, no, I don't want to read that, or no, I'm not interested in that. Basically, if the plot was good, it didn't really matter where it came from. They would be interested. And I try to use that I used that as my influence, and tried to do the same thing myself. So I read books from Russia, and I read books from India and Italy, and there was a lot of women's fiction that I read. That's when I read Distant View of a Minaret by Alifa Rifat from Egypt. So back then, I was a lot more diverse in the type of countries I was reading from because I was experimenting, because I was developing such a love for Japanese fiction. I kind of wanted to like keep trying to discover other countries that I would really love the fiction from. So that was kind of my influence in college, but mostly, oh, I also read Harry Potter in college. It's actually kind of funny because like most people on YouTube, BookTube, you know, they're quite young, and so they read Harry Potter in elementary school whenever they came out. I was already in college, and I didn't hear about Harry Potter until already book 4 had been out, I think. And it was actually my mom who came in to my room because I was in college and I was still living at home because I was going to the university in my hometown. And she came in and she gave me the book 1 to Harry Potter. And she's like, I really, really like this. Like I tell you, my mom does not discriminate with books. Anything goes, pretty much. As long as it sounds interesting. She's not like a fantasy. She's not going to read that kind of book. And she's not a science fiction. But for the most part, if something sounds interesting, like she'll pick it up and she'll try it. And she gave me a book 1 of Harry Potter. And I just read it because, again, I trust her. And it was great. And so I like read books 1 through 4 in 1 week. Book 5 just happened to come out at that moment, so I read that as soon as it came out. And then book 6 and 7, I had fun with everybody else, and I didn't go to like midnight, book readings parties because I wasn't, not to that extent. But I would find the book at Target and then just read it that day, and it was fun. Like I got to participate in a little bit of that, and that was really, really fun. Like it was good times. But yeah, that's, if you're ever curious if I've ever read Harry Potter, I have, but I read it in college when I was already above the fanaticism age. But yeah, that was basically my college. There's a lot of experimentation, but mostly starting to get a grasp of history and then Japanese. Like, I read Shiro Bamba for the first time. Oh, and I discovered Kobo Abe in college. Oh, amazing. So, 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 so good. So good. After that, I went into grad school. Now, grad school was tough for me. I was a chemistry grad student. You don't have that much time. You have to study for your own classes, but you're also TA. But you also have to do research, so you have to be in the lab. So you were a very, very busy person. And when not busy with school, basically we partied hard. Like we would, there were a lot of house parties. We would drink, and shenanigans arose basically. So it wasn't really a reading time. Actually, I was more using reading as a means to procrastinate because I struggled during grad school. And so to sort of relieve stress, basically that was when I read Don Quixote, it's when I read The Count of Monte Cristo, it's when I read The Three Musketeers, because at that time I really wanted something long and something I could just fall into and just ignore the rest of the world, which is basically grad school, because grad school was stressing me out. I did not like grad school, and grad school did not like me very much. But yeah, so like grad school didn't really have time to read. I was part of this. Very briefly, I was a book reviewer for a now defunct women's fiction online literary journal, basically. And that was fun, but I discovered that I'm not a book reviewer. I don't know how to write that kind of stuff. I'm not good at it. And I'm also just not good at following like self-imposed deadlines. I wasn't really good at it. So I only wrote a few, but I read quite a bit of women's fiction back then, and it was interesting. The books were, like standard 3.5 stars if you're going to go for a 5-star system. So nothing truly outstanding, but it was like fun to experiment and try something new. But yeah, other than that, grad school, not really a moment to read. Now, after that, after I finished grad school, like the biggest event was in my reading history was I had graduated grad school and I was working, and on my birthday I went to a sushi restaurant by myself because I had just been dumped and I had no one to celebrate with my birthday with, because as I said, grad school didn't go very well, so I didn't really have good friends. So yeah, I was at a restaurant by myself. I went to eat sushi and I ended up making friends with the sushi chefs, and they were actually really nice. They took me out. After their shift was over, they took me out to a bar to celebrate my birthday, which was really, really nice. And I actually became really good friends with one of the chefs, who is Japanese. And actually, he's a huge reader, like crazy reader. He reads everything. And I was hanging out with him one day and I was looking through his shelves and I was kind of fawning over all of his books that were in Japanese. I'm like, oh, I wish I could read this, because I had forgotten my Japanese. I hadn't used my Japanese in a long time. And so I just didn't know how to read anymore. And he just he gave me a book. He gave me Ryu Murakami's Kagirinaku Toume ni Chikai Blue, which is translated to almost translucent blue. Almost transparent blue. Yeah, almost transparent blue. And he's like, just read this. And I'm like, this isn't Japanese. I can't read this. It's like, it's not gonna happen. I can't. No, no, I can't do this. He's like, no, if anyone can do it, you can do it. So he gave me this book, and I didn't read it right away, but I kept the book. And even when I moved back to Texas, he gave it to me. He let me keep it. And then eventually, it was the inspiration I needed to start studying Japanese again, and I did that. And then eventually I just said, hey, let's read this book. And I started reading it. And that was sort of the beginning of my journey of rediscovering the Japanese language. And so with that, sort of rediscovering my love for literature and Japanese literature, et cetera, because grad school had kind of killed all of that. So yeah, that was the biggest turning point for me, kind of in those days. There wasn't, I had pretty much followed my reading tastes as they were up until that point. But that was a huge turning point. Now after that, all those days, I moved back to Texas, and I was looking for a job. It wasn't going very well, and then I had a boyfriend, and that was going very well, and I was super enamored with him, and we spent all of our time together. So I wasn't really reading at that time all that much. I just continued reading my Japanese literature. That was primarily all I read, was just Japanese literature with some French classics here and there. And then that's when I started reading Japanese fiction and nonfiction as related to the war, and that was really like transformative for me. Just discovering that I absolutely love history, discovering a period of history that I found fascinating, and being able to make the connections between the fiction and nonfiction about the same era, and then just also being able to understand Japan more as a whole was just really interesting and fascinating. So, I mean, that's pretty much brings us back up to now. Now, when I first moved to Japan, I wasn't reading that much either. There was one year I struggled to read 8 books. That was the very first year, I think, that I moved back to Japan, because reading was not my goal. My goal was after work, I went to bars, drank to sort of lower my nervousness so I could practice speaking. My goal was to make friends and really try and start creating a life here, and not even creating a life, but just trying to milk every moment of every opportunity in Japan, because I didn't know if I was staying here for a year or 2 years or 3 years or 8 years as I am at this point, but I didn't know. So I just wanted to milk every opportunity, really just try to just talk and practice and my speaking thing. So I didn't really read at that moment, so there wasn't really anything during those days. But at the beginning, so when I started rereading again, it was pretty much like everybody else. It was in 2020 because of COVID and whatnot. And so now I'm pretty much, over the past few years, I've transitioned more to Chinese literature. Really am super fascinated by that, and that came from reading nonfiction history, because obviously if you're reading about Japan during the war, you're going to be reading about Nanking. And if you're reading about Nanking, then you're reading about China. So then you need to read about Tiananmen Square, and then you need to read about Mao. And then once you've read about Mao, I just keep building on that. Whatever I read, or whatever I've read previously, definitely connects to what I'm going to read after that. And that's just been a really fun discovery for me. That just discovering that I really enjoy reading history has been mind-blowing, really fun, because I think it definitely follows the kind of fiction that I always enjoyed, which interestingly enough isn't really historical fiction, but I always really enjoyed fiction that talks about some sort of thing, something about society and the society we're in and how people interact with each other. And a lot of the books I enjoy reading are about almost the negative qualities about humanity, the qualities that we all contain, that we all have. We kind of try and pretend like we don't. Jealousy or egotism or human, like our basic hypocrisy, and just things like that. So almost sort of like a survival of the fittest and whatnot. So that has definitely always been the type of literature that I really enjoy. And so I think that really ties really well with history, where you're trying to especially books like Mao, where you're trying to see how one person and his egoism really affected entire society as a whole and history as a whole. So it becomes really fascinating. So you can really get a really good tie-in between the two. And that's just really, seriously, that discovery has been absolutely amazing. Just absolutely fascinating. Really happy with that. And then, yeah, so where are we now with this? So lately, I still love the fiction that's on my shelves, and I still want to read it. But when I'm at the bookstore, I definitely find myself wanting to discover more nonfiction. I want to read a lot more Asian history. And lately, you'll notice I think I'm starting to love American stuff again, or not again, but well, maybe kind of again, because in high school when we read all the books that we did read that was American fiction, like I really, really, really enjoyed all that stuff. So I think a few years ago when I read Lonesome Dove, which is just absolutely amazing. Lonesome Dove, seriously just the perfect book. But reading that and, having already had a taste for Cormac McCarthy, and then Tim O'Brien, but yeah, and then discovering the nonfiction last year when I read Colt of Blood, which is about the Texas Rangers. Yeah, and now reading this book about the Comanche Indians, like, yeah, reading about America has just been really, really very, very interesting. And I really think that's definitely influenced by the politics these days, and just sort of trying to remind myself that, like, this is where America came from. Like, America was based off of these things. So it makes sense that it still continues. So reading MLK's nonfiction about one of his speeches, not the I Dreamed a Dream, but another one of his speeches and the civil rights movement and things like that, really makes me want to read more about America again. So I'm really interested. I really think I'm going through a bit of a transition these days. I'm where right now I'm definitely leaning towards China, and I'm leaning also towards America, interestingly enough. I find myself stepping away from contemporary Japanese fiction, although I still want to continue with that because I still really enjoy it. And more or less, I pretty much still enjoy it. But I think definitely for me, Japanese fiction definitely hit its peak when I was reading Showa era Japanese fiction, or post-war Japanese fiction. That for me is like the biggest moment of Japanese literary history that really had the biggest effect on me, and like that I really liked the most. So yeah, like I'm curious to see where things go on, and I really love seeing like the transition between my reading history, and like what were the triggers that really influenced my current reading, and whatnot. So yeah, I just really wanted to discuss that and talk about that with you, and kind of just reminisce. I think that's just really, really fun. So in any case, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again in my next video. Bye.